very interested in anyone requesting information about the USS Eldridge. And nearly 30 years later, this man, Alfred Bielek, would make it all but impossible to put the lid of secrecy back in place.
My original family name is Edward Cameron. When I first became aware of my involvement with the Philadelphia Experiment in January of 1988, I had no idea how extensive my use by the government had been, nor where my research would lead. But it includes the Philadelphia Experiment, the Montauk Project, mind control, some discussion of aliens, and it all fits together. Trying to understand how they fit together in the complex web that has been created is the purpose of my bringing to you vital information which has been kept from you by your government and the media.
What was the Philadelphia Experiment exactly, and why would the U.S. Navy have been spearheading the research in the first place?
At the time that the Philadelphia Experiment was supposed to have taken place, German U-boats were destroying nearly half of the shipping that was going across the Atlantic. Both the British Admiralty and the U.S. Navy were desperate in finding a way of combating this lethal threat. If scientists of the caliber of Albert Einstein and Nikola Tesla had even remotely suggested the possibility of turning a large naval ship invisible, even if it was only invisible to enemy radar, the admirals would have certainly have decided to explore that option.
The stated purpose of the experiment was to prove whether or not you could make a ship invisible to radar. The original purpose was optical invisibility. Two scientists came forth with unproven theories which became part of this experiment. By 1943 in the United States, Einstein's concept of the ideas of the interaction of electricity, gravity, and magnetism seemed suited to the idea of electronic camouflage. But implementation of the theory would require the use of some of the concepts of another great scientist, Nikola Tesla. Tesla was the project originator and its first director. Einstein and others, including Dr. John von Neumann, worked together to perfect the theory. All of these men worked together very closely on this project, and I was privileged to work with them in my original Edward Cameron timeline.
The stage was now set for a journey into the unexplored realms of science. But did the Navy or even the scientists know it would also be a journey into the future? Did any of them really believe it was possible for a massive warship to just suddenly become invisible? And who exactly is Ed Cameron, and what does his so-called timeline have to do with anything? The ship chosen for the experiment was a non-commissioned destroyer escort, named the USS Eldridge at a later date. So far as can be determined, none of the 30-plus men aboard the ship were told what the test was all about. All they knew was that they were going to make us invisible. The crew was comprised of specially selected and screened volunteers from the entire Navy, including non-coms. But was this something that the government would take seriously, even if the scientists proposed it?
In the late 1970s, Dr. James Gorham recruited a group of scientists, just for fun, to see if there was any scientific basis for the events that were supposed to have taken place during the Philadelphia Experiment. To their astonishment, there was. In a laboratory, they were able to replicate radar invisibility using what is known as Tesla's egg of Columbus. So, it is entirely plausible that in 1943, they had the sufficient knowledge to conduct the Philadelphia Experiment. In fact, from what was known of the technology, it would have been derelict behavior of the Defense Science Research Board not to have conducted such experiments.
The device invented by Tesla for producing high voltages with low current is today used in one form or another in most radio and TV sets. It permits weak circuits to sustain voltage of almost any magnitude. His theories were perfect for the task at hand, but Tesla became disenchanted with the entire project. He was convinced that his inventions were being appropriated for purposes not beneficial to mankind.
The experiment was originally called Project Rainbow after it was classified, and it was executed in two parts. The trial run from the standpoint of invisibility went very well, but the effect on the sailors on deck was horrific. Sailors were sick, some were completely disoriented, but the objectives and goals of invisibility had been achieved. The decision was made to go ahead with the second phase of this test, with a test crew and 2 scientists on board. Those 2 scientists were myself and my brother. We also had on board my younger brother Jim, who was a Navy seaman and part of the test crew.
Tesla walked out on Project Rainbow in March of 1942 and was replaced by a man who by war's end would become a legend among scientists, Dr. John von Neumann. It's here that lives and timelines begin to converge.
I began my life on August 4th, 1916, in Bayshore, Long Island. My name then was Edward Cameron in that timeline. I and my brother Duncan grew up there. I went to Princeton in 1932, where I met Dr. John von Neumann for the first time. I later earned my PhD in physics at Harvard University, while Brother Duncan went on to University of Edinburgh, Scotland, where he earned his PhD in physics. After I left Harvard, my brother and I were recruited by Dr. John von Neumann to work on the Navy's Invisibility Project. We had to relearn our physics to include time, gravity, and quantum physics, but Dr. John von Neumann was an excellent teacher. My specialty, since I was reporting directly to the Navy, was the theories of invisibility. It was during this time that I met Dr. Einstein and Nikola Tesla. Although both men had already essentially left the project, they maintained a keen interest in its progress.
No, we didn't get the wrong pictures on the screen. Al Bielek, the man speaking in the first person, is Ed Cameron, whose life and family are well documented. But in order to understand how Ed Cameron got to be Al Bielek, we have to go back to August 12, 1943, and the ill-fated second test. According to the letters written by Carl Allen to Morris Jessup, the second test didn't take place in the harbor, but somewhere in the open sea.
The result was complete invisibility of a ship and all of its crew while at sea. The field was effective in an oblate spheroidal shape, extending 100 yards, more or less, out from each beam of the ship. Any person without that sphere could see nothing save the clearly defined shape of the ship's hull in the water.
Carl Allen, or Allende, is the only person not aboard the USS Eldridge that day to come forward as an eyewitness. He claimed to have been aboard the steamer SS Andrew Faroseth as it passed within 100 yards of the Eldridge just as the test got underway. He was so close, he said, that he actually shoved his hand and arm up to the elbow into the visible force field that extended from the ship. Many years later, Allen described what he saw for investigators.
I watched the air all around the ship turn slightly, ever so slightly darker than all the other air. I saw, after a few minutes, a foggy green mist arise like a thin cloud. I watched as thereafter the DE-173 became rapidly invisible to human eyes.
I don't know what Carl Allen may have seen that day. So many strange things happened. But the USS Eldridge disappeared from its location in the Philadelphia harbor. My brother Duncan and I boarded the Eldridge that day with the understanding that this was to be a test to determine radar invisibility only. We were not attempting optical invisibility, but it happened anyway, at least partially. You could barely see the ship through a thick green fog. We obtained radar invisibility in about 70 seconds, but that's when things began to get strange. We didn't know it in the control room, but the ship disappeared right out of the harbor. There was a hole where the ship had been, and then all of a sudden, there was no hole. It was just calm waters. Duncan and I saw the banks of electron tubes glowing in a strange way. Then we started getting high voltage arcing, like tiny lightning bolts. The radio was nothing but static. We went for the main power controls, but they were frozen, so we decided we had to get out of there. But up on deck, things were even worse. There was a greenish haze everywhere. Sailors were wandering around, totally disoriented, almost to the point of being crazy. We couldn't shut down the equipment, and we could not contact anyone ashore, and we had no idea what was happening to the rest of the crew, so we decided to jump overboard, but we never hit the water. We felt like we were falling through a tunnel. We didn't know where we were or what was going on, but after what I guess was about 2 minutes of this, we wound up in a military base at night with a chain-link fence at our backs. Suddenly there was this helicopter beaming a light in our faces, and we didn't even know what a helicopter was. They were still experimental in 1943. The next thing that happened was the military police came out. They grabbed us, took us to a building, and then pushed us on an elevator. We went down several floors where, upon exiting, we were met by an elderly man who introduced himself as Dr. von Neumann. We thought this old man must be crazy. He couldn't be Dr. von Neumann. We had left him about an hour before, and he was a much younger man.
But that was just the beginning of the surprises in store for Ed Cameron and his brother Duncan. The man who introduced himself as von Neumann informed them that they were not in Philadelphia in 1943, but in Montauk, Long Island, and the year was